Hello, everyone. Jimmy here, grower here in Boileau, Quebec, and it is 1.5 degrees centigrade, about 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and raining, which is kind of fun because the 3 feet of snow that's still on the ground is actually trying to melt. So maybe one day we'll see the ground and we'll start being able to make compost, which is what we're talking about tonight. Anyway, before we start, I'm going to go ahead and answer a question that came across. It was somebody who had bought my book and had questions about seed starting. And if you're out there and you haven't ordered it yet, here it is, the Veganic Grower's Handbook, Cultivating Fruits, Vegetables, and Herbs from Urban Backyard to Rural Farmyard. Available pretty much anywhere, everywhere. Go ahead and get it. It's the best $40 Canadian investment, $30 US investment you will ever have into your gardening future. Guaranteed, it will help you become a better grower. So she was having a little difficulty finding the seed starting ingredients that I put in my seed starting mix. And one of those was soybean meal, organic soybean meal. Now, there's a product called Down to Earth Organic Soybean Meal that you can get everywhere in the United States. You can get it through Amazon. You can get it directly from most nurseries online, just typing in Down to Earth Soybean Meal Organic. But for whatever reason, now in Canada, I don't know why, we can't get it. So her question was, could she replace a liquid fertilizer with that dry powdered soybean fertilizer? Now, the difference between a dry fertilizer and a liquid fertilizer is going to bond to the soil very quickly, going to be easily uptake by the plant very fast. So you're going to basically be giving it a boost. That's why usually when people run their greenhouses, or if you yourself run your greenhouses in on your small farms or in your homesteads, or even just for your own personal use, and you water your seedlings with that liquid, whatever plant-based fertilizer you're using, then the plant's going to uptake the nutrients right away from the roots. Whereas the difference between a dry powder is it ends up fusing with the soil, and then over time, the fertilizer will be available for the plant. So the plant will take a little bit when it needs it then, and take a little bit when it needs it a week later, and takes a little bit when it needs a little week later. And this is why in dried form, it is usually better for those seedlings that are going to stay in their pots for a period of time, or in their cells, or in their trays, or whatever you plant them in, for that period of time of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. So there really is no substitute for the dried soybean meal. Alfalfa meal is usually not a problem. You can be able to find that pretty much everywhere, as well as rock phosphate and kelp meal. The thing about soybean meal is it has a really high nitrogen ratio of 7 per weight. So there really is no substitute in the plant world for that. So just like all good gardeners do, I've tried to do an experiment. So we grow soybeans here. You can get dried soybeans at your organic grocery store in vrac, in bulk. And what I've tried is to see if I could create my own soybean meal. Now, there's many methods online, and they're talking about fermenting it, and they're talking about, extracting the oils and doing this or that. Well, for me, I wanted to see if it was possible just to create something where it was very simple. I don't have an oil extractor, and I don't have I do have a grinding mill, but that's another story. So what if I just soaked the soybeans like I was going to eat them, soak them overnight, and roast them a little bit just to dry out some of the water. Now, my first attempt, and I just did this, I've done a trial of 2 different plateaus of microgreens of broccoli rabe, which is in the brassica family. And one tray just had a soil mix, but no soybean meal. And the second one had a soil mix, but with soybean meal that we created. It smells roasted. So, they're very tasty. I ate one. So I figured that if it was good enough for me, maybe it was also good enough for the plants. And just so I know, if you're out there, go ahead and send me a message through the chat and let me know if you're there, but I don't know. I may not have turned it on this time. So if you're out there and you're trying to send a message, it doesn't go through, I'm sorry. But you can put a like, that way then I know that you understand what I'm saying. Anyway, so that was my first attempt. So the second attempt is going to be soak the soybeans overnight and then roast them. Okay, got somebody. Perfect. It's working. Great. Thank you, Rhonda. And then roast it for say 5 minutes and then grind it up just to dry it out. Hello, Siri. So those are the two different methods. And this is just a way to kind of create our own soybean meal because the plants really like it. So anyway, I will, as it goes, I will let you know of the results. As the broccoli robs grow up, the little seedlings grow up, I'll see which is greener, which are healthier, which have thicker stems. And we'll go from there. If it's the one without the soybean meal, then I know that it's not super important. And if it's the one with the soybean, or my soybean meal didn't work, and if it's the one with the soybean meal, then I knew for sure it worked. And hello, Anne from St. Lazare. Glad you're there. All right, so that is your hello, Veg Meg from Quebec. Yeah, it is a cool experiment. And I think that as growers, in order for us, now I know you out there, you're probably thinking the same thing. Everything is getting so expensive. I just had my delivery from my greenhouse company today, and the price of our potting soil, which is a peat moss based potting soil, went up like 50% from last year. So everything, now maybe it should be that expensive. I mean, we are extracting it from the earth, but we know that everything is getting more expensive. Hello, Kim from England. Nice to see you there. So in order for us to try to create our own potting mixes, and I talk about this in my book about regenerative ways to create your own potting mixes or seeding mixes, it is for sure that we need to try to make it with our own compost and with our own dirt and with our own chip branch wood that's decomposed, or our own leaf mold, or whatever our experiments are. The only thing that I'm going to say from a homestead perspective, where you are really relying on all that food to come in, or from a sales perspective where you're even more relying on all that food to come in, do your experiments in advance. Do what works for you. Thus my seeding mix in my book, it specifically says what has worked for us and work extremely well. I am trying all the time more regenerative ways to create that soil mix by doing these experiments, by bringing these ingredients in, by changing the mixture around. So I'm eliminating the amount of off-farm inputs that we're using and doing the least disturbance to our planet Earth, right? So there we go. So that's what we're gonna. So that leads us into the absolute best thing that we can do for our gardens, for our homesteads, is learn how to be professional compost makers. So that's what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about Veganic Compost. Here it's raining. Then we're going to talk about Rainwater Collection, which is always cool, ponds, and irrigation. So let's get to it. So hello, Catherine from wintry Quebec City. I bet it's snowing up there. It's raining here. We're a little bit south of y'all. So why is veganic compost better than an animal-based compost, besides the fact that we're not exploiting any animals? Well, I just had an interview a couple of days ago, and we talked about this specifically. And really what it is that when we're using plants to make a plant-based compost, in order for a plant to be healthy, so a plant is green and it goes to flower and it goes to seed and it goes to fruit. I mean, it goes to fruit and it goes to seed, and everything is perfect. Everything is working really, really well. And the plant is gorgeous and the fruit is tasty. Then we know that the plants are getting absolutely every one of the 17 macro and micronutrients that they absolutely need to thrive. Now, if we are to use those plants, so let's say we end up harvesting dry beans and we have those plants and we are use some of those plants to then mix in with our compost. This is just an example. Well, then all of those 17 macro and micronutrients that went into that plant are now going to go right into your compost pile, right? So this is pretty cool. So all of your green material, all your nitrogenous material that you're going to want, you're going to want it to be as diverse as possible, as green as possible when it's used. So we're talking about cut grass, green grass, or clover, or some of your cover crops like buckwheat or oats, or the green plant material if you have some around that you can cut out and put into your compost. To back up a little bit, what's going to be absolutely better for all of our gardening systems is to let all of those plants decompose in the fall. So it kind of makes for kind of a strange, so how do we have enough greens for the green part of our compost material? Well, that's where your kitchen wastes come in. So if you're eating tomatoes and you have like the end of the tomato, or you're eating carrots and you have an end of a carrot, or whatever it is that you have, that's your green waste. This is also going to have pretty much all of those macro and micronutrients in it that are specific to each vegetable. So the more or fruit. So the more diverse your kitchen waste is, and as vegans, we eat very, very diverse. So all of that kitchen waste that goes in then into your compost pile is going to also bring in all those macro and micronutrients. Now, that's not the only way the macro and micronutrients are getting in there. Also, the microorganisms. The microorganisms are going to be working up and through and in and out of the pile. And what we're learning about microorganisms is that they change over the course of the season. So in the wintertime, now around the trees, because it's so warm, the heat is beating on the trunks of the trees. It's creating open areas around the trees. We're starting to see the snow fleas come up, which is a type of arthropod, and we're starting to see movement even a little bit in that soil. And what's happening is all of those microorganisms that are moving around, they're bringing nutrients around as is necessary. They're eating things, they're creating nutrients, they're dying, they're creating nutrients. And so it's just this lovely interweaving, like my hands, interweaving, moving system. But they're going to die completely. And what's going to replace them is microorganisms that are alive in the spring. And then there's microorganisms that are alive in the summer. And then there are microorganisms that are alive in the fall. So everything changes. There are some that go from one season to another, but there are some that change. And I don't have all the names of the microorganisms, so don't ask me, but this is what we know. So why is this better than, say, an animal-based compost where people are using manures? Well, manures, for example, are really the waste product of all of that good nutrition, all of those good minerals and vitamins and carbohydrates that were being used, that were grown, that were then used by the animal, and they've taken all of that out, and then they've released their waste product. And that's what people are using to believe that that is a good product for their ground. Now, interestingly, most animal-based composts are actually mixed with plant-based compost. Because if you don't mix it with plant-based compost, you're really not going to grow anything at all, because just growing in straight manure doesn't work. So anyway, we all know it's terrible for the animals. It's terrible for the environment. It's also not great for your soil. So all of these books, this is myth busting 101 today on manure. All of those books that say you should use manure, all of those books over the course of the last 100 years who have said that this is the product that makes our earth, our soil alive, it's just not true. Because we know that basically the world is a plant world. Without plants, without soil, without plants, we don't live. And everything eats plants in some way or another, or eats an insect that has eaten part of a plant that then they eat. So in the end, it all stems from plants. So it's the plants that create the compost around the world. In the end, it was always plants that created the soil life. All right, so there you go. So when you're just developing your compost, you probably want to try and figure out what is your primary purpose of your compost. And there's many different ways of looking at it. So if your primary purpose is that you want to have a replacement, you want to use that compost as your seed starting mix. Well, you really need to get that compost broken down to, this is what when we're talking about carbon to nitrogen ratios, carbon to nitrogen ratio of at least 14:1. Better would probably be 12:1. Because at that point, it's broken down to the point where it really does look like good earth. And it's not going to continue to take out nutrients from things from the green material to continue to cook, that will then cook your little seeds when you're trying to plant them. So if what you're trying to do is use your compost for a seed starting mix, then you need to have it break down for a period of time. It can be 6 months with a plant-based compost. It might even be up to a year, depending on your brown material that you're using. To make the best compost, to make the best plant-based compost, you can either use a 1-to-1 ratio of brown carbonous and green nitrogenous material, or 2-to-1 green nitrogenous to brown carbonous material. The more greens that you have, the faster everything will break down. The greens, microorganisms, the browns, the microorganisms will all work together, and the greens will just start breaking down those browns, breaking them down. Now, if you have too many browns, if you have too much dried hay, if you have too much dried leaves, if you have too much trip branches, it will break down over time. It's just going to take longer. I have a pile of chip branch wood that we get from the tree surgeons around, and it might take 3 years before it breaks down to a point where we'd want to put it into our garden. But if I take one part of that and mix it with 2 parts green cut grass that I cut every few weeks out of my green strips or out of a place that's around our fire pit, where we don't want it to be as tall as our heads, so that we can have a nice place just to sit by the fire, well, then we will allow that brown compost to break down even faster than if it was just by itself. So in my book, I have a really nice layering system. And what I have learned from all of my journeys around Central America, Hawaii, here in Quebec, is that the best composts, the composts that are going to work the best, are the ones that are layered, whatever size you want to make them, whatever height you want to make them, and then covered. No matter where you live, if they're not covered with some sort of a plastic, and really it's best with a recycled piece of plastic. You can use whatever you want. There's recycled plastic pretty much everywhere that you can use. And the reason why this is really a good idea is because when the rain beats or the sun beats, or it starts composting, when it starts composting, all the methane gets released from the compost. All the carbon gets released into the atmosphere. You want to trap that into the pile. There's no reason to release it. I mean, this is a problem. Whether it's composted animal manure or composted plant-based material, there's still going to be carbon released if it's open. And this is defeating the purpose. We want the carbon to stay in the pile, and then when we spread it in our gardens, we want to have all that carbon still there. This is the principle, right? So you really do need to cover it. And if you don't cover it, what's going to end up happening is when it rains, all the nutrients are going to leach out. And when it's sunny, like it was in Arizona, like I've seen in the piles in Hawaii, where even I've seen them in Quebec, is that it gets really, really, really dry. And it takes a long, long time to decompose, right? The other thing that I noticed, and this is something that everybody should consider based on what your particular reason for having a compost is, whether it's your seed starting or preparing your beds before planting with compost, or using it as a side dressing material for your plants, or making compost tea, you should really have more than one pile. You have one that you make, and make it so it's, 3 or 4 feet tall, whatever's manageable to you. And then after it's that size, move on to another one. Let that one sit, let it relax, let it go ahead and do what it wants to do, which is decompose. Go ahead and start another pile. What I noticed pretty much everywhere, and even with home gardeners, is that they just keep adding to the same pile and adding to the same pile. And then, maybe they dig a little bit out of the middle, but just keep adding and adding. Well, if you keep adding and adding and adding, you're never getting pretty much the whole pile to where you want it. Here, we always have at least 2 piles every year, one from the fall and one from the early spring that we're using by the end of the year. So we're always using 2 of our 4 piles. So hopefully that makes sense. So you layer your pile. The best method, again, this is all in my book, but I'm going to explain it because it's super fun. You put it right on bare earth. And the reason why you put it right on bare earth is because in the bare earth, there's microorganisms. And as soon as they see something else good to eat, they're going to go, all right, I'm going up. I'm going up. I'm going up. I'm going to go chew and eat. So the microorganisms are there. On top of that bare earth, I always like to put like some layers of twigs or dried plant material. So it's kind of like a crisscrossing pattern. And why I like to do this is I like to give it a run for all the rodents, all the little mice, the moles, the voles, the shrews. Everybody now has a place that they can go and run in and out if they want, because those are little nutrient engineers. They're little mining engineers, right? They'll go in, they'll make little holes, they'll create air pockets. They're just fantastic, all those little mammals. Ground beetles will go in there even more readily. That's why usually when you pull up all those dried sticks, there's all this insect arthropodal life there. It's just lovely. So cross with sticks. Then on top of that, you want to put your green material. Then you want to put kind of a small little layer of dirt, of earth, preferably your garden soil, because the garden soil will also have microorganisms and mycorrhizae and everything that's good in your soil. Not a lot, just a dusting, just enough so that it's there. Then on top of that, put your dry material and then continue with the process. Green, a little bit of soil, dry, green, a little bit of soil, dry. And when you get to 3 or 4 feet, create kind of a volcano. And in that volcano, pour some water in. I don't know, pour 10 liters, 20 liters, 40 liters of water, whatever you think. All that green material is already full of water if it's nice and green. But if you go ahead and water it, then the water will percolate down slowly. It'll kind of get all around through the pile, and then cover it and hold it down. And leave it like that for a month. You don't have to do anything after that. Now, when you're harvesting all your materials, it is best to try to have everything all at once. And here soon, and some of you might have places where you can already start. Rhonda, you're over outside of Spokane, Washington, so it's possible that you can just go ahead and start if your ground is open enough. So you start gathering up leaves, dry plant material, chip branch wood. If you have an electric chipper, great, or you can also chip it yourself. The smaller pieces, the better. But it doesn't have to be tiny. It can even be that long, but eventually it'll all break down. And then your green material. So what we're going to have now while there's still snow is we're going to have all of our kitchen waste. But if we've let all of our plants kind of decompose on the bed, say in late April for us here, or early May, and other people it will be now, you can take some of that plant material out because the microorganisms are already feeding on what they can. You don't have to take out the roots, just take out some of the plants, just take a rake. And some of that is still going to be a little bit green. And that you can use as your green component, which is pretty neat. So you take that out, it's going to also have micronutrients. Now, if you do end up taking out some root systems, so let's say you're growing corn, sweet corn, or you're growing milling corn, and all those roots, they're going to have dirt on them or soil on them, good living soil on them. So if you put those right on your pile as a sort of brownish material, well, you're already going to have a little bit of your native soil, so you don't need to put extra. That's what I'm getting at. So cover that pile for a month. Start your next pile. Do it exactly the same way. After a month, you uncover and you smell. First thing you do is you smell. And you'll know if you've had too much greens or too much browns. If it's too much browns, it'll be kind of cold. If it's too much greens, it might be really, really hot and kind of smell like ammonia. It'll smell kind of rough. Whoa, you're like, whoa. And it might be a little slimy. And it's ammonia nitrate, right? So I believe that's right. So if you realize that, so after the month, you want to turn it. It is a little bit of work. I'm not saying it's not, but you just want to turn it. And if you notice that it's still too wet, well, grab some more dry leaves, grab some more dry straw, grab some more dry plant material, grab some more chip branch wood, and add it in. So you're soaking up that water. Then you don't need to water it. If it's already wet, you don't need to water it anymore. So turn it. You're basically going to turn the top on the bottom. So this is going to be your third spot. So you have your one spot that was your original pile. Your second spot is the one that you're trying. And right next to that spot where the one was cooking for a month, you have a third spot. And you just turn it. on top of itself, and turn it on top of itself, turn it on top of itself. And you cover it again for another month. Now you have another space. There's all that sort of dried, crisscrossing branches there, and already some composting material always, which is like your compost starter. They actually sell compost starters pretty much everywhere in nurseries. It kind of makes you laugh because compost makes more compost. So if you have a compost pile, you always have a compost starter. It's like a sourdough starter. So if you make a vegan sourdough starter with your flour and your oat milk, and you let it ferment and you make your bread, if you leave just a little bit and feed it again with more flour, and more oat milk, then you're going to have more sourdough starter, because all the starter creates more starter. Well, the same thing with compost. Hopefully that makes sense. To me, it makes perfect sense. No reason to have a compost starter. No mean to activate it in any way. The compost is already activating it. Hopefully that all makes sense. So you've just turned your first pile. You're now another month. It's pretty sure that after that 2-month period, if you've done it like I've said, if you've layered it well, if you've covered it, this really is the key. If you don't cover it, it won't compost in 2 months. It really won't. But if you cover it, you should have usable compost. It may not be 100% broken down. And you know what? That's okay. There is a ton of crops that would not mind. One is corn. They will not mind. You can go ahead and spread it down and plant your corn seedlings. Here we do seedlings instead of the seed because we try to get a little jump up. You can plant your dry beans. It's no big deal. You can plant your cover crops right in that sort of what we call it new compost, the compost that still is breaking down. But it's not breaking down so much that it's going to take nitrogen or other nutrients from your plants. Actually, it's going to do quite the opposite. It's going to, when it rains or when you water it, it's going to filter down. The nutrients are going to filter down. And basically, it's going to create sort of a mulch layer on the top. So it's going to act as like a water retainer, like a mulch does. But it's a nutrient-rich mulch because it's been composting. It's really fascinating, and it's really, really cool. And if you haven't ever done it this way, I'm telling you, okay. So here was the experiment last year. So I ran out of compost that was ready of my chip branch wood and green grass. And so I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my cucurbits, my winter squash, zucchini, cucumbers, what we were going to do with that. And we had read in one of the gardening books that it was possible you could use a new compost. Now, I think for them, new compost is 4 or 5 months old, but here it's like about 2 months old or 3 months old. So we decided to use that new compost right on the beds before we planted all the cucurbit seedlings. And would you believe that it was the most amazing year of cucurbits last year ever? Now, there was other things that we did, like we waited until the 20th of June. For us, that was when we could do it. Now, if I'm talking the 20th of June, then if you're in like the northern part of the United States, maybe that's the 20th of May. If you're down south, that's probably already maybe in another couple of weeks. You could be putting in your cucurbit families, but for us, it was then, and we just waited. So with the combination of the warming nights, that new compost that was still breaking down, I had zucchini plants that were 4 feet, almost 5 feet tall. And I had maybe 7 to 8 winter squash per plant. My butternuts on my acorn squash, on my, even on my red curry squash. I mean, it was just a nutty year. Nutty. That was one thing I did. The second thing that I did, and this is another very interesting principle, and I actually learned this from one of our certified veganic, our NAVCS farmers. And if you haven't checked out that site, it's certifiedveganic.org. And it has a list of our farms. There's not very many yet, but we are getting bigger. And it gives a list of the standards if you wanted to be certified veganic. But one of our farmers also does this. They use green hay from their fields. They cut it and they just mulch around every one of their plants, all of their brassica plants, all their tomatoes, their potatoes when they're growing, everything. They put a 5-gallon bucket on the plant itself. They mulch all the way around it. They pull the 5-gallon bucket off, and they're pretty good size. They have a couple of acres, so it's not. I think they have 5 under cultivation every year. So we're not talking small gardens here. We're talking a big system. So they say, oh, that's a lot of work. Well, they do 5 acres, so it's not that much work. And that green hay, which is exactly the same thing that we did to mulch all of our cucurbit family last year, that green hay continues to provide nourishment because the green hay breaks down, it fuses in with the soil. There's all those good macro and micronutrients that the plants want, and it continues to break down. Hopefully that all makes sense. So, and yes, so if you want to use it as a seed starting mix, you're going to need to let it compost longer than that. You're going to need to let it compost maybe 6 months or 8 months. But it also doesn't need to be completely composted. What you can do is you can build a little screen. And it's basically a box with a 1/2-inch hardware netting. And you put the soil into the box and you shake it, and out comes actually it would be 1/4 inch, comes the smaller soil aggregate that then you can use for your seedling mixes. Pretty cool. So you can really use it for whatever you want. So what we do here to make it really simple, to make it a really awesome circular process, we always screen some out because we always put compost in our potting mix to pot up our seedlings and for our onions and leeks that are in their trays a long time. So we screen some out in the fall, like in late September. And then we take the rest of it and we bring it into our greenhouse to plant our fall greens, or we cover it, and then that is a compost that we can use right away as soon as the ground opens, even though it's not 100% broken down because we've taken out a lot of the soil aggregate, but it's still material compost making more compost. Hopefully that all makes sense. Yeah, Rhonda, that's a really good question. Doesn't the cut hay contain seeds that grow and outcompete the veg? Yeah, you cut it before it goes to seed. What do you think of that? So you can go ahead and let it go to seed, and it's going to take some time. So if you think about when you put the hay, you're not going to put the hay on when the seedlings are small. You're going to put it on when it's bigger. So when we mulch our cucurbits, they're always starting to vine. So if you put the mulch underneath, even if there is a little bit of seeds, the vines are just going to take over because all that nutrient is there. So yes, if you were to use cut hay and just put it down and there was nothing planted yet, it's for sure that you were going to have the floral seeds, the floral plants come out. But if the plants are already established, then there's less of a problem. Hope that makes sense. You should try it. If you have cut hay, if you have access to cut green grass, it's really fantastic. In some places, you can actually get like organic bales of alfalfa straw. Oh, this is amazing. In Arizona, this is what we could get, and it would be amazing. I mean, really, it's about $8 to $10 a bale, and it will provide many, many, many patches, many, many feet of mulch. Or you can go ahead and mix it into your compost, and it might even be better. So your piles are layered, they're turned 1 to 2 times, they're managed at a manageable size, and they want to be covered. Really, other than that, that's the secret behind compost. When I used to see them, I can remember a couple of places. Well, let me go back to my one in Arizona and all of my attempts in Arizona, which none of my attempts were good. Can I add stagnant water to my compost heaps? Stagnant water such as, keep going with that, stagnant water like ponds? Pond water should be fine. I take it from my rain barrels, no problem. And that would be stagnant water from water butt. I still don't know what that is. Water butt. Sorry. Keep explaining. Anyway, yeah, I mean, if it's pond water, which would be pretty much stagnant, yeah, it shouldn't be a problem at all. I use it all the time. I actually use pond water to irrigate my fields. And I can't really say it's stagnant because there is life in there. So I'm not even sure. Water container which has been sitting over winter is a term used for. Okay, great. Yes, you can. I do all the time, and it should not give you any problems at all. People say you could. I mean, maybe you don't want to drink it. Some people say that it can cause problem for the plants that you're growing, but it's what we use all the time because rainwater collection is incredibly important. It's the easiest way. So yeah, don't worry about it. Putting it in your compost is fantastic. The micronutrients or the microorganisms for the compost will eat whatever is in there that could possibly be not great. I mean, sometimes you have like, if it's been sitting over winter, it's got a little warm, you're going to have maybe a little green algae. Well, green algae is going to have micronutrients, right? It's going to have phytonutrients. If you're going to mix that in with your compost, it's probably going to make it even better. About the only thing that you can't really do direct from a rain barrel, especially if it's been sitting, is just drink it direct. But I have no problem putting it on my patches. There you go. Answer your question. So now I got a new word. Thank you, Meg. Water butt, rain barrel. Got it. So what about Humanure or sanctuary manure or bedding or urea, our own urea? Now, none of these are considered veganic. With certified veganic, none of these are considered part of our standard. But obviously, we need to figure out a way to use our Humanure so that it is being recycled back into the earth somehow. So the best way that I've come up with it, now this would work for humans, this would work for sanctuary animals that are being rescued, this would be their bedding, this would also be urea, is to make compost, let it compost down, and put it into an area that needs to be revitalized. An area of your property or your hedgerows where maybe, just maybe, they're, well, it's not something that you personally are eating. Now, I said that it's not, using manure is not great. It's not great for the soil, and it's not by itself. So all Humanure and all sanctuary manure is going to have a really large component of plant material. So it really brings up the question of, is it really something that we want to use in anything that we eat, or even around our fruit trees, or in our herb gardens, or our perennial gardens, or ever? And me, I just don't know. I really haven't gotten there. I mean, I do have a Humanure pile. I have a composting toilet. I bring out the bucket when it's full, and I put it in a pile, and I put it by the trees. And there are microorganisms, and there are faunal life that want to use it, and they go and use it. And eventually, it kind of blends in. But as you know, with a pile, I mean, even in the compost pile, there's stuff growing. In a Humanure pile, I don't put anything but dried leaves and potash or wood ash, and nothing grows on it. Something will grow on the side, but nothing grows right through the middle. So this is just something to consider. For sure, we don't want to be flushing it with water. So there's got to be a way. Some people have said that, and I do like this idea. A lot of our properties, and I have a big one here, I still don't know what I'm going to do with it. A lot of our properties have been so damaged by humans. Either they've been scraped away, land has been scraped out for a septic system or to look for water for a well, or here topsoil was taken off. And if there are places where there is just absolutely nothing growing at all, well, you don't want to use the plant-based compost that you're using to grow your veg. I mean, if you make enough, I guess you could. But if you want to use that Humanure with a good plant, you're going to have to put your plant material in there with it to help it break down, and try to spread it thinly so that something might be able to grow back. Well, then this is a good way of using it. Obviously, a lot better than flushing it with potable water. When regenerative animal agriculture talks about the use of manures, where they're kind of paddock grazing these animals to mimic the way the bison used to roam in North America, or the wildebeest roam throughout the continent of Africa, they're missing the fact that this was a couple million year process, and the animals were able to live for themselves, and they traveled vast distances, a lot larger than any of these farms are talking about. So the buffalo ranged from Saskatchewan to Texas, 2,000 miles, 3,000 kilometers, and no farm is that size. And even if you had interlinked cattle ranching farms, which I would never recommend, cattle ranching farms all the way from Saskatchewan to Texas, it still would not meet the same principle as what the buffalo did, because again, these animals are being raised to be killed, not to be raised for themselves. But it's obvious that there was manure, and those particular beings in those particular environments, they would produce a lot of manure. I mean, bison are huge animals. So if you had million, and what I've learned, this is very interesting, what I've learned is that the bison came over throh Beringia also. They came from Asia. So before the people ever came across, the bison came across. And there is actually some scientific evidence now to point that it wasn't people at all that killed all the woolly mammoths out. It was actually the buffalo or the bison that pushed them out of their environment because of their numbers. So in North America, in Canada and the United States, say 2 million years ago, supposedly the major megafauna were woolly mammoths, which is like a woolly elephant, and wild horses, which were about twice as big as that they are now. Well, when those bison came across, and that was about 700, 800,000 years ago, maybe a million years ago, when they came across the Bering Strait and they came into North America, they were in such great numbers and such prolific breeders that they ended up just pushing the mammoths and pushing the horses to more marginal lands, just by a simple fact of their numbers. Think of it like the raising of bees. Like when we raise European honeybees and we bring them over to North America, it's not that they're super aggressive with the native bees, but it's just that they're so prolific that they just kind of push out the native bees to the fringes, because they take over, because there's just so many of them, depending on what bees are, how many beehives people are raising. So obviously that's not a good idea either, and we shouldn't be raising bees. Well, this is the same thing that happened with bison. So I think this is really interesting. So not only did the bison come over and displace everyone, so they were sort of a non-native species at one time. They were an exotic that took over, kind of like colonization. Very funny. And then they did deposit their manure here and there as they traveled along, and that would fuse with the soil. But again, no more than what the plant materials were happening before. And we don't know what the woolly mammoth numbers were. Of course, they were depositing their manure, and we don't know what the wild horses were, and they were depositing their manure. But again, you were talking about millions of years of time. So anyway, this is just a little monologue thinking about it. There is no way that in a regenerative animal agriculture system that we can bring back that sort of mimicking of nature as it was 2 million years ago. There's just too much land that has been destroyed by humans. The best thing to do is to create plant-based systems, as we all know, as we'll talk about all the time, is that create plant-based systems where we're using less land, producing more on as little space as possible, letting the rest of the land rewild. Well, perfect. So figuring out ways to using your Humanure, always a good point of reflection. Try to figure out the best possible method where you live. I've actually tried to use it because I thought it would be very smart. It didn't matter to me at a certain point that Veganic used it or didn't use it. I thought it would be, and I will answer your question, Peaceful Vegan. I tried to use it on my fruit trees, and I think I killed them all. I think it just wasn't composted enough, or the microorganisms were so ferocious. I guess they were so hungry that they basically went down and ate the roots, but they killed it. And it had been a pile been sitting for 18 months. So even after 18 months, I didn't think it was good enough. The one human product that I think is really interesting is urea. I would not, I do use it from time to time on experiments on garlic where I do dilute it 20-1 and I pour it on the green shoots of garlic that come up. And between that and using like a plant-based tea of comfrey and stinging nettles, I can't really see the difference. So it means that neither one is doing damage and neither one is doing better than the other, right? So if you want to use it, use it. You know, we don't consider it veganic if you want to be a certified veganic farm, but you know, again, if you're on a homestead and you want to use that product, use it. It's not 100% sterile. There are trace elements that come out. THC will come out. There are, if you're taking any kind of medication, that could come out. So it's something to consider when you're using that. Now, to answer your question, do I recommend any compost bins? Actually, I don't recommend any compost bin, none. Your best pile is going to be one right on the ground, no bin at all. I have had bins. I've had the rolling compost bins. I've created bins out of cement blocks. I've created bins with chicken wire and wood that you can open and move and transport. And what I find is just kind of a waste of time and very expensive, where the best piles are actually going to be right on the ground themselves. So clear a spot. Can be 3 feet by 4 feet, 2 feet by 3 feet, 1 meter by 1 meter, really doesn't matter. Create your spot and create your pile right on the ground. Now, if you live with a balcony setting, go to the Veganic Agriculture Network. They have interesting information about how to compost on your balconies. That's not what we cover here, but I find it super cool. You can actually create balcony compost or maybe rubber bin compost. So if that's the kind of situation that you're thinking of, do that. Otherwise, if you have any space at all, do it right outside. There's always a spot. Hope that's clear. Rainwater collection, since that came up from a water butt. I like that. Rain barrel. Okay. So where you live, it is always a beneficial practice to collect rainwater. Sometimes you have it around the winter time. Here I have 5 rain barrels that I will install here in the next couple of weeks as the snow starts melting and the snows turn to rain. And we can start using that to water all of our seedlings in the greenhouse and all of our first greens in the greenhouse. You can also use snow if you live in snow country. I have a barrel in my greenhouse. Obviously, the greenhouse gets warm, the barrel gets warm, and the snow starts melting. So I will actually just put snow in there, and then it'll melt, and then I'll put more snow, and then it'll melt, and then I've got snow melt water that I'm using to water my greens. It's pretty cool. Some greens, like overwintering spinach, which I just harvested today. I harvested about 1 pound, which was really fun. Here we are, the 23rd of March, and it's one of the earliest times ever in this kind of winter where the snow just doesn't want to leave. And I'll put snow right on the beds because spinach doesn't seem to mind. And snow is, I don't know, maybe -1, -2. It's not like it's -20 Celsius. So the snow will percolate slowly. It'll melt slowly, and the spinach just loves it. It just grows right back out. So whatever nutrient was in whatever little atmospheric nutrient was in the snow, it will now go into the spinach greens. So the best way to collect water is from any kind of downspout. It can be a downspout from a barn, from an outbuilding, from your composting toilet, from your house, and it's best to put a barrel. Now, depending on how you want to set it up, you may want to put it up on blocks or build a little wooden table that it sits on so it's up a little higher. And from there, you can either drill a hole and put an on-off valve so that you can just open a spigot and take the water out and fill up your watering can, or run it to a rubber hose that goes right into like a drip tape system wherever you want to go. Best by putting it up, you're using one of the best energy sources, free energy sources in the world, other than the sun and the wind, which is gravity. And the gravity can just push that water down for you. If you don't want to put it up all that high, you can just go ahead and dip your watering can right in, which is kind of what I do. It's the way I get my exercise this time of year. When I'm trying to fill up my rain barrel, I'll just dip my watering cans in and dump it into my rain barrel in the greenhouse. It takes about 5 minutes, and I can do 100 liters, and there you go. But by collecting that rainwater, it's a free source of water. Yeah, there's really nothing better. And if you live in a place that's arid, obviously you're going to have to figure out a way to do it, but then have a way to cover it. Now, what I've seen along the way, and this is a really interesting way of doing it, you can buy those above ground pools. Sometimes they're kiddie pools. They're kind of a pool liner. Sometimes they're bigger, and some people have these at their homes, these sort of outside pools. Well, two places I saw, one in Quebec and one in Hawaii, they had it above ground, and then one was from a well that they would pump the water in and then irrigate from there. And one was directly from the downspouts, and the water would come in, and they had a cover over the top because they didn't want a lot of beings to get into the water and die off, obviously. But in my head, I think to take the extra time and dig and put your pond liner in the ground, fill it with some sand or some native earth, and let plants grow up and grow on the side of it, then you're going to actually create a multifunctional a system of cleaning your water, because plants are water cleaners, and animals and little water creatures are going to help clean your water, right? So even if it's sort of stagnant, which it isn't in a pond, but even if it just sits there, the plants are going to take what nutrients they need. And yes, there is going to be maybe an overabundance of some nutrients, but when you move this into your soil, the soil microbial life is going to eat most of it. And then you're just going to have the water that you needed to water your plants, right? So I would recommend this if you have the space for all your homesteads out there and your small farms. If you're not collecting water now and all you're using is an underground pump to water, or your spigot from your house, well, consider trying to have at least one rain barrel. So if you're in a backyard setting, have at least one rain barrel. My step-parents that live in, my father and my mother-in-law that live in Montreal, they have a great place where they could have a rain barrel. They don't do it, but they should, because then they could just use that instead of turning on the water from the city. They would have rainwater. And if you live in the countryside, well, then you have the golden opportunity to be able to take those rain barrels and run it down to a pond system, either through hoses or whatever you like. It's really whatever you want to design. And also in my book, I talk all about this, because here was the first time I actually got to realize it. It's chapter 9, Irrigation and Rainwater Collection. Here, it was the first time I actually got a chance to realize it. And it was a dream that I had in Arizona. In Arizona, I was considering an underground cistern system where it would probably be almost like a cement septic tank, or maybe some sort of really thick rubber bladder that the water would get in, and then I would pump it out. And it's a little bit of a convoluted system, but even there, I could have probably figured out a way to build an above ground system, because we did get rain and we did get rain and snow in the wintertime. And there was the monsoon season, or what they called it, where the really fierce rains would come in August, September, and October. And this would have been a great opportunity to collect water. And I just never got around to it. And the soil was really easy. All you have to do is put any kind of a liner, and a pool liner is about the cheapest thing that you have. You can go ahead and create different systems, which I think are really neat. You can create a clay line where you grab clay from one section of your property and you maybe mix it with some straw and almost make like I'll think about what that's called in a minute. I have the name right in front of me. Anyway, so it's almost like the idea of like adobeing your house, right? You have straw and a clay component and a sand component, and you're creating sort of this natural adobe, or natural adobe stucco that you could then put on the bottom of your pool. Or you can use a natural clay, or you really trial out whatever you want and whatever works for you. But creating a system where you're collecting water and then collecting it from the rain spouts themselves to the pond and then to your fields makes perfect sense to me. And it works here exceptionally well. In good rain years, I don't have to use my house pump at all. Everything goes from the pond. So I have 5 barrels that then filter down to a pond. So we're talking 500, 600 liters of water. Every time it rains about 10 millimeters, it's almost 600 liters of water. And all of that filters down to the pond during the time of year where we need to water down there. Think about this, something to think about. The reason why you want to create an underground system is obviously for wildlife. Here, it's really amazing how things evolve and adapt. I started really by just having a plastic liner, a heavy duty plastic liner. It was really all I had to put on my pond so that I could collect water, and then that was it. And then I realized, well, that was ugly, so I'm going to go ahead and start putting dirt. Like sometimes when we weed in our fields, we have these sort of big mottes of big moutons, the word in French, big patches of, say, clover that if we don't take out of our beds, then we're not going to be able to plant anything. They're just too big. So we'll take some of that as we weed, and we'll go ahead and put that, and I'll take some of that sod and I'll put it all around my pond. I'll recycle it all. And then all of a sudden that starts growing. And sometimes when we have our perennial plants, they just get too bunched. So you want to separate out your perennial plants, like your daisies or your lemon balm or comfrey or whatever. And then I'll put that around. And so I did this. And then, of course, then the birds come in and they drop some seeds here and there. And then the herons come in, and then the frogs come in, and the little animals come in, the skunks come in, and the raccoons come in. And now what I have are cattails growing in there. And I don't know how they got there. I mean, obviously someone brought it there. It wasn't me. And so now I have cattails growing in my pond. So now I've got a wildlife pond. And this is really the coolest thing in the world, because it's for the benefit of what? Not just for us, but for all beings. And this is what we want to try and do with our entire gardening system. Our compost is going to be the best possible compost for our gardening systems. It's going to make our plants healthier, which is going to be good for us. It's going to be for all beings. When we collect water, we're not using electricity, and we're using the water for the ponds that are then not just for us and not just for the plants that we grow, but for all beings to share. Very cool. Cattails the same as catkins. Meg, if you're out there, ask them about catkins. Yeah, they have kind of a brown top on top, and then they kind of explode, and then the pollen is there. They're an edible. The plant itself is edible. And I think you'll know what we're talking about. I'll see if they're catkins, but I don't know off the top of my head. Somebody out there might know. So yeah, so when you're thinking about using that pond, then you want to think a little bit about your irrigation system. I talk about that too in my book, and your irrigation can either be by hand if you're a bigger system, and depending on if you're in a dry environment, you want to use drip tape. If you're in a sort of more wet environment and you have sort of more patches everywhere instead of rows or runs of plants, then you want to maybe think about a sprinkler system. The sprinkler system requires a little bit more pressure. The coolest part about a drip system, depending on your gravity flow, your gravity rate, you can actually have the drip tape just go right from gravity. So you don't need any kind of pump at all. So it really depends on where you are and where your system. A lot of people, even if you're a small homestead, you can get away with just hand watering as you need. I find this really long and labor intensive, but if you have more time than money, then that's what you can do. It's really all about your best system. All I can give is what's worked best for me. I love drip tape. I used it in Arizona. I had a completely automated system because it was 2 hours in the morning of watering and 45 minutes in the afternoon every single day because it was so hot. Here, it's based on needs. So I have a pump that is attached to that I install into my irrigation pond, my wildlife pond. And when I need it, I turn it on and I can control it. I have it all set up so that I can water this section at a time, or turn off some on-off valves and water this section at a time. So it's about envisioning what it is that you're looking for, what your personal situation is. It's always about your own personal situation, and everything is regional. So what I do here may not be great for Spokane, Washington, may not be great for somewhere in England, but then again, it's all ideas that we can all pull from, because we're all in this together. We're all here for each other and one big community. Speaking of, I only got about a minute left, so there's all sorts of cool coming events. Gosh, these shows just go too fast. So March 25th, so this coming Saturday, certified veganic grower Susan Craig at 2 p.m. Eastern has a show. There's a Facebook event. I believe it's going to be a Zoom conference. Learn how to grow your own food veganically with the Grow Bio-Intensive method. This is the John Jevons method. She is an expert in this. She works with John every now and then. John Jevons? Jim Jevons? Anyway, John or Jim. Mr. Jevons, that's better. She works with him. She's followed his courses, and now she's a teacher and student. She's a student as well as a teacher of it. So check it out if that's something you're interested in. March 30th, the Vegan Organic Network, a YouTube Veganic Gardeners Question Time at 2 p.m. Eastern. I will be there with 3 other wonderful growers and horticulturalists talking about whatever it is you want to ask. So Sound Healing Academy webinars, if you're there again and you want to ask me about catkins, I'll know for sure if those are actually cattails, and I will know for sure what a water bun is. April 8th, 1 p.m. Eastern, how to grow a 100% vegan garden with Learn Veganic, which she is here with us today, VegMeg, collaborating with Project Animal Freedom. All of these things can be found on Facebook events. And my next show here, April 27th, preparing your garden spaces and season extension for the early harvests and your sales. So like always, I appreciate you all. I am so happy that you've taken the time out with me. Thank you so much for listening and sharing. And if you ever have any questions about anything, you can always post on my Facebook or veganicgrower@gmail.com, anything that you want to ask. And that's all I have. So until I see you next time, peace. Have a lovely time of it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.